Okay, Exodus chapter 28, verse 1. And take thou unto thee Aaron thy brother, and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office, even Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's sons. And thou shalt make holy garments for Aaron thy brother, for glory and for beauty. And thou shalt speak unto all that are wise hearted, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. And these are the garments which they shall make: a breastplate, and an ephod, and a robe, and a broidered coat, a mitre, and a girdle. And they shall make holy garments for Aaron thy brother, and his sons, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. So we're continuing with the idea or the thought of the tabernacle and it being built. Moses is up on the mountain. He's getting the instructions for how to make the tabernacle. And last week we touched on the altar and the grate of the altar, the courtyard itself, and the gate of it, and then the oil for the menorah or the candle stick. So with that said, as we get going here, we're going to look at these priestly garments and Aaron himself, but mostly the priestly garments and how those garments are included as part of the tabernacle. It's almost like you've got the tabernacle and everything that's involved with the tabernacle, and then you've got the clothing. And the people are going to change, but the clothing remains the same throughout it. And especially when you start talking about the ephod and then the breastplate itself. So if we think in terms of what the tabernacle is, and remember, Jesus tabernacled with us, and we can see some of the parallels through the building of the tabernacle, everything from the holy place and the most holy place, and the articles that are within it, and how it's gold, and the colors, and everything has a relationship that you can begin to draw a connection back over to Jesus with. But then you have even the courtyard itself and what it looked like from the outside, and then from the inside, where the things for the holy place, most holy place, were golden. But on the outside, you remember it had the four layers. That the last one was the badger skins or the porpoise skins, and so outside it looked kind of drab, but you walk in and it's glorious. And then outside you have the brazen altar, and the various things that are related to judgment, related to the bronze or the brass. And again, the idea of the bronze and brass is that there's copper in there, which is the hissing. The definition is that it's a metal of hissing, so it makes the reference back to the serpent itself and the red within it. So all these little fascinating things. So the clothing itself is tied into this entire activity of not only worship but atonement and the priesthood. And you'll have different characters come and different characters go, but that always remains, and that's what is really fascinating here. So the first paragraph here is basically an overview. It's for Aaron. Take unto thee Aaron thy brother and his sons. So you have Aaron and then his sons Nadab and Abihu and Eleazar and Ithamar, and how they're going to come into that role of the priesthood. Later on, we'll see that there was this great worship service that was taking place, and Nadab and Abihu actually got involved in that worship service and offered strange fire, and fire came forth and consumed them. So even though they were the sons of Aaron, that they were still obligated to worship in a manner that God prescribed. And we can see the example of that all the way back to Cain and Abel, where Cain and Abel were told to bring a sacrifice. Abel brought the sacrifice of the animal from his flock, but Cain brought the work of the field. And and he was downcast because God didn't accept that sacrifice. God defined what the type of sacrifice was, and he didn't worship God in the manner that God defined. And that's another thing that's very pertinent to our culture today is we don't necessarily look at how God wants us to worship. We want to worship him how we want to. And to see that and then look at Nadab and Abihu and to look at all of this having to do with the tabernacle, God's very descriptive and very defined as far as worship. So it's valuable for us to have that in mind when we worship God. We want men everywhere to lift up holy hand and that sort of thing, where not to say that we have to lift up hands, but where we don't quench that either, but where we go before God and we say, God, how do you want me to worship you? So it defines who is worshiping and who's in that role of the priests to make that connection for the people to worship. But then it also says that these are the garments that they'll make in verse 4: a breastplate, an ephod, a robe, a coat, a mitre, and a girdle. And some of these phrases may, we'll look at them in further detail here. So in verse 5, we start with the ephod, which, by the way, is kind of an apron. So they're going to have clothing or trousers on, and then there's this ephod that goes over, but they're going to have a robe underneath that, and then an ephod, and then a breastplate that goes on the front. So the ephod itself, and they shall take gold and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen, and they shall make an ephod of gold, of blue, of purple and scarlet and fine linen with cunning work. And it shall have the two shoulder pieces thereof joined at the two edges thereof, and so it shall be joined together. So basically it's something that is connecting with the shoulder pieces, but the fact is that it's made of linen, and then it has these colors that are woven into it. And the fact that it's linen, remember we sort of touched on a few weeks ago, the linen was white, and it represented righteousness and sinlessness, God's glory, so to speak. You remember when Jesus was changed and transfigured, that the clothing he was changed into became white and shining and glorious there when he was with Moses and Elijah. And then there's gold here, which represents eternity and value. There's blue that's woven in, which is a picture of heaven. And then the purple, nobility and royalty. The scarlet, atonement and a covenant that's taken place. So these are all sort of built in and joined together in this ephod that the high priest is going to wear. And it says again that you shall make the ephod of gold and blue and purple and scarlet and fine twined linen with cunning work. In other words, with artistry and with detail in mind. That we were talking about Hawaiian shirts and sweaters. That they get the best people to do these things. They don't have it's not like, hey, I did my best effort on a practice round of making these things, and then it's you might have one side that's a little longer, or it's hanging down in a funny way. No, these were put together, and as much as they can be done to perfection, crafted to perfection, that they were. And they took craftsmen with that in mind. They looked for them with that in mind to create these garments. So let's see. Then we get into the girdle or a belt here. So we have sort of an apron, and then we have this girdle, and it says in verse 8, and the curious girdle, which is kind of an interesting phrase in the King James, the curious girdle, but it's like it's an intricately woven band or belt. It isn't just a belt like a leather belt. It's something that's woven and it's detailed, and it's we might compare to sash today, or something that's really beautiful. But then it has again all these colors associated with it that are woven into this linen. So it says, curious girdle of the ephod, which is upon it,
shall be of the same, according to the work thereof, even of gold, and of blue, and purple, and scarlet, and fine twined linen. So the gold itself, somehow they were able to make that as like gold thread and put that through. It wasn't just like some orange brown thread that they found that looks like gold, but that they actually did it with gold, which is amazing in and of itself, because it would be a fragile garment, and it would be a fragile belt if you're talking about strands of actual gold. So, nevertheless, just beautiful. Would have been just a beautiful thing to be adorned in. And then it gets into these onyx stones, which are interesting. In verse 9, it says, "And thou shalt take 2 onyx stones and grave on them the names of the children of Israel, and 6 of their names on one stone, and the other 6 names on the rest, and on the other stone according to their birth. And with the work of the engraver in stone, like engravings of a signet, thou shalt engrave the 2 stones with the names of the children of Israel. Thou shalt make them to be set in ouches of gold," and ouches would be like settings. "And thou shalt put the 2 stones upon the shoulders of the ephod for stones of memorial unto the children of Israel. And Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord upon his 2 shoulders for a memorial. Thou shalt make ouches of gold, or settings of gold, and 2 chains of pure gold at the ends of wreathen work, or wreathen work shalt thou make them, and fasten the wreathen chains to the ouches," or again to the setting. So what's happening here? They have these onyx stones that are actually going to go on the shoulders of the ephod. And specifically, it says that there's 2 of them, so 1 on each side. And I always want to be careful when I get into the numbers side, because when you start equating numbers to details that come up throughout the Bible, it can be helpful. However, a lot of people will, again, use the numbers in the Bible as a means to forecast, to soothsay, to predict, to fortune tell, get into all sorts of weird things, which is numerology in its worst occultic sense. And this is where the there's an aspect of Judaism that got into mysticism and the occult, and it's that study is called the Kabbalah, which is where, especially right now, we're hearing about the Cabal, and it gets into the occult and mysticism from a Jewish standpoint. So you have you had Jewish rabbis that were really getting into the meanings of these numbers, and to the degree that it could be predictive. And you just have to be careful, because it's on the edge of mysticism and the occult. So all of that said, the point being, that's my disclaimer, because we'll come back around.
Okay.
So that's the disclaimer. But you do see recurrences of numbers, of course, 7 being complete, and 6 being mankind, or man, and that being the day or the time when he was created, and so on. And in this case, we kind of see the same thing. Usually, the number 2 is used to define truth through the Bible. You'll see that recurring. By the testimony of 2 or 3, everything is established. Judgment, not in the sense of I said judgment, but truth, to define something that is legitimized. So accusations, don't receive an accusation for an elder unless it comes by 2 or 3 witnesses. Again, this got into the capital punishment for stoning people, that you couldn't just stone a person based upon 1 accusation. That it had to be 2 people or 3 that bore witness together. And of course, we see that going awry, having to do with Jesus, because you had false witnesses that came up and then began saying falsehoods in a number of 2 or 3 against Jesus. But the point is here is that there's these 2 onyx stones. So you could equate that to being
the truth or the witness that's going to end up resting upon the shoulders of the high priest when he's wearing the ephod here. And it tells us, this is kind of interesting, that it's an onyx stone. And the onyx stone, generally when we think of onyx, we think of a black stone. But it's actually not that. It's one that the literal meaning for this is something that's bleached. So it's sort of a pale um, green stone. And just the very fact that that's the type of stone that's used, that's placed there. It's when you bleach something, or more specifically, the word speaks in terms of like scalding it. So if you were to scald vegetables, or if you were to cook something, you're putting it in like boiling water. So you kind of see the connection with the stones, that it's something that's being bleached out or scalded in hot water. So you have both the judgment of heat there, but then you also have the washing of the water. And this is what is upon each one of each shoulder, and it has the names of the tribes of Israel, on 6 on one and 6 on the other. Which again, you have the witness there being 2, you have the mankind number of 6, and then you have 12 as government. And you'll see that pretty consistently through the Bible, these numbers as they come forward. So you have these, again, these 2 stones. They're upon the shoulders, and as it reads forward here in verse 12, it says, "Then Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord upon his 2 shoulders for a memorial." So again, this is, as the high priest, it's as though he's bearing the load for Israel there, and it's resting upon his shoulders. We know about Jesus, "My yoke is easy, my burden's light." Why is it? Because he's carrying it. Because he's carrying all of that load. We're not carrying it. We're just kind of along for the ride. He's bearing the load. And it's a really great picture. I remember a particular pastor emphasizing that the yoke is kind of like when you see movies and you see the 2 horses pulling a carriage. In this case, it would be 2 oxen that are doing the work, and one has the yoke and he's carrying it. The other one is just sort of pulling alongside, but it's really the strong one who's doing all of the work. And we get the idea there of Jesus doing the work for us. We're just sort of with him. We just need to be with him, and there will be some burden or some load, but it's light because he's carrying it. And so we see that picture here with these stones. Let's see what else about that. 2 chains, verse 14. Moving on from there, it says that there will be 2 chains of gold at the end of wreathen work. Thou shalt make them and fasten the wreathen chains to the settings, or the ouches there. So this is how it's actually held there, is with chains and so on. And we're going to see that this is all part of a network of clothing. It isn't individual pieces, but they end up all being sort of fastened together, because you'll have, first of all, the ephod, and then you're going to have, on top of that, of course, he's going to have clothing underneath that, linen underneath, and you have the ephod that fits over, and then you're going to have the breastplate. And those are all held together with gold chains and so on. When we think of gold chains, all we think about are those heavy gold chains that rappers wear. Not quite the same thing, but they are gold, and they're it's one network that's all put together. So the breastplate itself, verse 15. "And thou shalt make the breastplate of judgment with cunning work," or detailed work. "After the work of the ephod thou shalt make it of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet, and of fine twined linen thou shalt make it. 4 it shall be doubled. A span shall be the length thereof, and a span shall be the breadth thereof." So a span is supposed to be the width of a man's hand. People generally just say it's half of a cubit. So if it's 18 inches, then that'd be 9 inches. So I don't think I've got, maybe one's kind of curled, though maybe I can get more out of that. But the point being is the span, it would be about 9 inches square. That's the size of this breastplate. And in verse 17, we get into the settings of stones here. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time with regard to these stones and meanings and so on. I'm not going to get so much into the meanings, because as you look through, you can look at the original meaning of the word for the stones, but as they're translated, they actually have different meanings, and then they ascribe, okay, well, this is for that person of that tribe, and so on. And then you find out, well, what is the actual order? And there's some differences there as well. So we'll just look at it and see how it unfolds. In verse 17, it says, "Thou shalt set in its settings of stone, even 4 rows of stones. The first shall be sardius, topaz, and a carbuncle. This shall be the first row." So the first row would be sardius. In the actual color of that is supposed to be ruby red. So NIV says it's rubies. So that would be ascribed more than likely to Reuben, and sort of works, right? Reuben, ruby. That one, that convention does not follow through. It only works on that first one. But then you have the next one, topaz, which is sort of a yellowish green. That's Simeon. And then carbuncle, which is reddish purple. And NIV says that that's beryl. And anyway, carbuncle, but that would be for Levi. You know what's interesting about this too is that Levi is actually included here. Why is that? Well, because the priest is representing Levi, even though Levi doesn't have an inheritance, his in the sense of a land inheritance, he still needs atonement. So he's covered there, and it's fascinating because the way that the tribes actually unfold throughout the Bible differ. You'll remember that Joseph was broken out into Ephraim and Manasseh, that instead of accounting allotments for land, later on we'll come to this, that instead of it being the tribe of Joseph, it was the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh, and that still got us 12 because Levi didn't have an actual territorial allotment. So we'll see this later too in the book of Revelation. Dan's excluded, and we see, there's a lot of fascinating distinctions. How you have 13, but then it's 12, and how it breaks out differently depending upon what God wants to convey. Okay, so the second row. So you've got a 9-inch plate, 9-inch square plate of gold, but then it's got these stones on it, and the stones are 3 by 4. So the first one, of course, is sardius, topaz, carbuncle for Reuben, Simeon, Levi. And then the second one is emerald. Well, I'll just read it. "The second row shall be emerald, a sapphire, and a diamond." So that would be for Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, which is interesting because some of these end up going in different orders than the birth orders. And this is where it gets fascinating to me, as far as people trying to ascribe significance to the colors, but then they go in different order. So some accounts give this definition for how the stones are set, but it's different from the actual birth order. So all of that said, we got the second row, emerald, which of course that would be green, and sapphire, which would be deep blue, and then a diamond, which is clear white. The third row is a ligure, an agate, and an amethyst. And the ligure, some of the other translations say adjacent, but that's sort of a clear but a yellow color. And then opaque red would be the agate. That's for Naphtali. So we have Dan, Naphtali, and Gad. And then amethyst, which is purple. And then the fourth row, a beryl and an onyx and a jasper. They shall be set in gold in their enclosings, or their surroundings. So the beryl for Asher would be sort of a green and yellow color, evidently. And onyx would be that pale green color. That would be for Joseph. And then jasper would be a bright green for Benjamin. And again, as you would look at the breastplate, the thing that emphasizes is that each one of these tribes are set in gold, and they're valued, beautiful stones, but they're all unique. So that's the perhaps the superficial view of it, without getting into too much potentially esoteric detail about all that. It comes down to the 12 tribes of Israel. They're glorious. And a couple of them are opaque, so you can't actually see through them. A couple are more, transparent, which, again, you can get into all sorts of meanings and connotations with that. The main thing is that this is going to be on the, it's a breastplate, so it's going to be covering the heart of the high priest as he goes in and offers atonement for the children of Israel. So he's got the load that he's bearing upon his shoulders, but then the glory being seen from the mercy seat, that God would look upon that and see the beauty of his promised people. So it is just very fascinating, and the idea that this is something that Aaron would wear and carry with him into that place of service is pretty awesome. So, okay, verse 21, and the stone shall be with the names of the children of Israel, 12, according to their names, like the engravings of a signet. Every one with his name shall be according to the 12 tribes. So each one of the stones has a name written in it, specifically. And that kind of reminds me of the book of Revelation. Remember, there's a stone, and there's an engraving upon it, and it's related to the churches or the people specifically. So the very fact that it's a stone is emphasizing that it's lasting, that it's something that isn't going to fade away, or that there's a permanence to it. Just like how Jesus was the cornerstone, and that the builders rejected, but he's the one that sets the pace for everything else having to do with the temple, and that is permanent, it's solid, it can be built upon, and how the children of Israel are sort of likened to that same thing, that there's a permanence there, that there's a long-lasting aspect to who they are, which is clearly seen because the promises that are given to Abraham, we see all the way through to and through the tribulation, and then into the millennial kingdom. So it's just one of those things that's going to continue forward. Okay, verse 22, and thou shalt make upon the breastplate chains at the ends of the wreathen or the rope of pure gold. So I'm not reading that right. So chains at the ends of the wreathen work of pure gold. Verse 23, and thou shalt make upon the breastplate 2 rings of gold, and shalt put the 2 rings on the 2 ends of the breastplate, and thou shalt put the 2 wreathen chains of gold in the 2 rings which are on the ends of the breastplate, and the other 2 ends of the 2 wreathen chains thou shalt fasten into the ouches or the settings, and put them on the shoulder pieces of the ephod before it. So again, what is happening here? This is just showing the network of how this is fastened to the ephod itself, how the breastplate is fastened to the ephod. So let's see, verse 26. Did I just read? Let's see, verse 26. And thou shalt make 2 rings of gold, and thou shalt put them upon the 2 ends of the breastplate of the border thereof, which is in the side of the ephod inward, and the other 2 rings of gold thou shalt make, and shalt put them on the 2 sides of the ephod underneath, toward the forepart thereof, over against the other coupling thereof, above the curious girdle, or that woven band of the ephod. So again, this is all connected. You've got the girdle, or the belt, and then you've got the ephod that is being held together in the belt, and then you've got the breastplate and the shoulder parts, and they're all held together with these golden bands and rings. All right. And Aaron shall bear the names. Nope, I didn't finish that. Let's see. Where are we? I think we're at verse 28, right? Mm-hmm. And they shall bind the breastplate by the rings thereof into the rings of the ephod with a lace of blue, which is interesting. Lace of blue. So this connection there of like a heavenly element here, the blue that comes in, that it may be above the curious girdle of the ephod, that the breastplate be not loosed from
the ephod. So again, you have this lace of blue, which is above the belt there. So again, you've got the belt sort of speaks of the support and the foundation of the whole thing, and then you've got this lace of blue, sort of like the heavens above. So you've got the foundation and then the heavens above it. So let's see, verse 29. And Aaron shall bear the names of the children of Israel in the breastplate of the judgment upon his heart, when he goeth into the holy place for memorial before the Lord continually. And again, this is what it's all about. First, he's bearing their names upon his shoulders, and now he's bearing them over his heart. And it really speaks again of the position as the priest who is making that connection before God, but on behalf of the people. And as we're going to see as we continue into Hebrews here, we see the connection of Jesus being our high priest, who's both a king and a high priest, and who has a place in the Holy of Holies, but also, having a place here on earth, and being able to be the true and full high priest once and for all for us. So we'll get to that when we get further into Hebrews. But so here we move on to the another aspect of this whole network of garments, which is interesting. It's the Urim and the Thummim. Thou shalt put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be upon Aaron's heart when he goeth in before the Lord. And Aaron shall bear the judgment of the people of Israel upon his heart before the Lord continually. So the literal meaning of these two basically they're elements, these two stones. We believe that they're stones anyway, that's spoken of as that, is that one means lights and the other one means perfection. So Urim and Thummim, lights and perfections. And we see some usage of this, but it's a curious thing. It has to do with the judgments, and as it relates further, it says, Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel upon his heart before the Lord. Basically what they did was they used this similar to like casting lots. If an issue came up that they were seeking the Lord about, that they would pull this forward, and one evidently meant affirmative and the other one meant negative. And there's not much else that's known about these things, though. It's a very mysterious part of the garments. And as things came up, then they would bring forth these stones, or they might bring forth one, and then as that's brought forth, that could be an affirmative. So it could be like, well, are we going to win this battle? Is this battle going to work out for us? David might say to the high priest, and then the high priest would go before the Lord, and then it would come forth and bring forth, one of these, and whichever one it was, it would be an affirmative or a negative, and then they would step out based upon that. The thing that I think is interesting here is that Carla and I were having a conversation about this because it came up, the idea of it came up with regard to the selecting of lots for the apostle who would take the place of Judas. You remember that they were like, well, we've got to pick someone, so we're going to draw lots, and then they went based upon how that worked out. So as a result, they were settled with it. The Old Testament, it's not even an Old Testament principle. It's the idea that you need to resolve a matter in order to move forward. You can have a question before the Lord and just never get it resolved, because you've got something, well, if we do this, you have your pros and cons, and you look at it and you say, I don't know what's going on. So then what they would do is they would take that before the Lord, and whatever that answer was, they would trust
unto the Lord God we trust that you're working through this and your answer is true. One of the things that are being studied in homeschooling right now is probabilities. And the downside of probabilities is that they're making an assumption based upon numbers and what's probable to happen. But with God, there's no such thing as a probability. It's a reality with God. And so there may be a probability having to do with even two items and saying, okay, when I do this, I've got a 50% chance, but with God, it's always going to be 100% chance. It's always going to be 100% reality. There is no chance with God. And you can do this, if you take two things, an Urim and a Thummim, and you could say that 50% of the time, if you do 10 of them, that 5 of them or close to that are going to end up being one and the same, right? You're going to have an affirmative 5 times. But with God, it could be all the same, all 10 identically. In fact, you could even argue that if you continue in that, you're actually testing God if he's given you the answer on the first one. That now you're just testing God, which is a lot of what happens with probabilities and guesses, and you start drawing lots because you do one and say, that's not really the outcome I was hoping for. Let's try 2 out of 3, see what happens. And you keep pushing that idea. So this was something that was in place in the Old Testament in order for people to move forward, to get things resolved. You don't know where you're going to go. You don't know what your decision is. Take it before the Lord. God, I'm going to trust that you're in these lots, this decision, whichever one comes forth, that's the answer. And you could do that, and I believe that God honored it. But the New Testament idea is unique because, well, let me just turn to it because it'd be better if I just read it. Romans 12:1 gives us a little different perspective on the idea of lots. And I can read it, but I know it, but I thought it would take some time. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We all want to know what God's will is, and that's why people drew lots. That's why you had the Urim and the Thummim. That's why you had those things there, so that you can make a decision and move forward with it, and you trusted that God was in it. But this is what's interesting here, is that in Romans 12, in 1, it says, by the mercies of God, to just present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, which is your reasonable service. It just starts by saying, God, I'm all yours. I am yours, and I am a living sacrifice unto you. Whatever you want to do in my life, I'm okay with. And then the next verse says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So basically that's saying that I want what your will is. You're the Lord of my life. So my body is a living sacrifice. Whatever you want to do with my body is okay with you, or is okay with me. I'm in agreement with you. And then to not be conformed to this world. It's where you decide in your mind that the truths or the things, the presuppositions that you have with regard to what you want to be true do not matter. The things that matter are just what God's truth is. So not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So as we just say, God, I'm all yours, and I'm open to your word, and I don't want to have any, presuppositions as far as what's right or wrong. I just want what your word says. Then it says that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Basically what that means is that we don't need something to resolve our life anymore. We don't need a lot, or we don't need to guess. We just say, I'm all yours, God, and I'm divorcing myself of my own will. And so whatever you want to do. And it says that you may prove sort of implies that the decision that we make, because it's by his mercy that we come to him in the first place, the the decision that we make is going to prove what God's will is. In other words, we don't need to find out ahead of time, oh boy, I hope this is it. Here's the Urim and the Thummim. I hope I get the affirmative. We don't need to do that anymore. We just say, I'm all yours, God. I am completely submitted to you, and I'm submitted to your word in every respect. I don't want to be conformed to this world in these things, but be transformed. And then you make your decision. And what you discover is that that's God's will. You're not discovering what God's will is. You're proving what God's will was all along. So you see the difference. One is related to abiding in the Lord and being given over to him, and him just blessing what our decisions are, because he's working through people that are viewing him as Lord of their lives. It's that simple. We don't have to, oh boy, I hope I don't make the wrong decision. If we're given over to God, there is no wrong decision. Is pretty much what the answer is. So we're not conformed to this world. Our bodies are living sacrifice. If we're in that spot, then it's just like if his yoke is easy, his burden's light, and I'm yoked with him, then pretty much if I'm with him and he says, hey, or he's pulling the load, and I say, hey, can we go left? Then he's sure, no problem. I'll carry the load, but let's go left. Because it's all within his will. See, we're with him, we're abiding in him, and there's peace there, and things can be reconciled. We can always move forward. We don't come to this impasse and think, oh no, I hope I don't make a wrong decision that's going to result in my death, or that's going to result in me being, some calamity coming. And instead it's like, whatever the Lord wants, even if it is something like an illness, I'm okay with that. Even if it's the direct result of going in that direction, because I'm with him and he's with me, and there's that trust. So we ventured off into Romans 12:1, but it does speak to this because they spent a lot of time having to do with the Urim and the Thummim and trying to figure out what is God's will. So Aaron would have these within his breastplate. And it's sort of the idea that they were there, but then they were concealed. The lights and the perfections were available, but they were there to judge the people. And then we get on to verse 31. And thou shalt make a robe of the ephod all of blue, and there shall be a hole in the top of it, and in the midst thereof, and it shall have a binding of woven work round about the whole of it, as it were the whole of the, I can't pronounce this word, but Harborgian anyway, that it not rent. So basically there's going to be a hole in it. It's a robe. It's all blue. It's glorious. And it has a collar on it, basically. And that collar keeps it from fraying, and it's just keeps it from fraying and falling apart. So moving on here, and verse 33, and beneath upon the hem of it thou shalt make pomegranates of blue and of purple and of scarlet round about the hem thereof, and bells of gold between them round about. So this is pretty neat. The around the bottom of the hem, there's going to be these little fruits there, these little pomegranates, and and some are going to be blue, and some are going to be purple, and some are going to be scarlet, and all along the bottom. And I think it's and then bells of gold, right? And bells of gold between and round about. So we'll see in verse 35 that that's so you'll be able to hear the high priest when he's walking around. He's got these little bells around him. And verse 34, a golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate upon the hem of the robe round about. And it shall be upon Aaron to minister, and his sound shall be heard when he goeth into the holy place before the Lord, and when he cometh out, that he die not. So, and this is where you get into the tradition is that they actually had a rope around the bottom of his legs, so the high priest's legs. So if he goes on in there and you're hearing these bells, and then all of a sudden you don't hear the bells anymore, you start to, maybe you pull on the rope a couple times, see if he's still alive, see if he's still there. And, obviously if you're a high priest, you'd probably pull back and say, yes, everything's okay, even though you don't hear the sound of those bells. Because they were at risk. If they weren't consecrated, if there was sin in their lives, if they didn't do things just the right way, when they went in there where the Ark of the Covenant was and the mercy seat and God dwelling in the Shekinah glory before them, if they weren't right, they're done. They get killed. So then they would have to drag them out. So they had these bells there in anticipation of the sound of ministry. Now, the other aspect of that, because we've kind of looked at it in the negative sense, but isn't it cool to think about there being a sound of ministry? When I'm at the church and nobody else is there, it doesn't sound like ministry there. It doesn't sound like anything's going on. But on Sunday, people get there and they start talking and fellowshipping and doing all that they're doing. And then during, upstairs, we may be singing and then sharing and having that time of fellowship. We've got kids carrying on and crying or laughing or chuckling or doing what they do. That's the sound of ministry. And I just like that connection there with Aaron, that there's a sound of ministry when it's occurring. And there's movement, there's activity, and that it's audible. So, unfortunately, because we're running this, sometimes we have to, kind of quiet down the sound of ministry. But it's much more fun when the teaching isn't going on and we hear all the fellowship that's taking place. But okay, where are we? We are at I read 35, right? So we're at verse 36. Need to wrap up here. And thou shalt make a plate of pure gold, engrave upon it like the engravings of the signet, holiness to the Lord. And thou shalt put on a blue lace, that it might be upon the mitre, upon the forefront of the mitre it shall be, and it shall be upon Aaron's forehead, and Aaron may bear the iniquity of the holy things, which the children of Israel shall hallow in all their holy gifts, and it shall be always upon his forehead, that they may be acceptable before the Lord. So the mitre, this is some people call it a turban. It's a head covering, and on that head covering is this golden plate that says "Holy to the Lord." And again, it's fascinating that it's right there on his forehead, and that it really speaks to the idea of continual worship before God from the mind. Shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we have that connection there, that golden plate that's there upon his head. So pretty awesome how that unfolds there. Holiness to the Lord, and that God would see that it's recognized by him, and that by everyone, because he's supposed to wear it all the time. Verse 39, and thou shalt embroider the coat of fine linen, and thou shalt make the mitre of fine linen, and thou shalt make the girdle of needlework. So there's a coat that we haven't really talked about, but this coat isn't one, generally we put coats on over us, and in this case it is over Aaron, but then he has the ephod, and then he has the breastplate. So he's got his own clothing, or this coat, and then we'll find out that he has something like trousers on, which are all linen. And then the ephod goes over the top of it, and then the girdle or the belt and the breastplate. And those are all integrated together with connections through the rings and with the gold. All right. Verse 40. And for Aaron's sons thou shalt make coats, and thou shalt make for them girdles, and bonnets shalt thou make for them, for glory and for beauty. Again, for glory and for beauty. So that's the whole intent here, is for that to be seen, the connection back over to God, that when somebody looked at the high priest, they were supposed to be looking at the image of God, so to speak, the glory and the beauty of God, which is why all of these garments and everything radiated that. And again, the idea of God's glory and beauty encompassing or including the children of Israel as stones is pretty awesome, because it draws that connection that the God has promises, and if we think of that in terms of who he is, that he has Israel near him all the time, and that the redemption and the atonement and the whole plan of Jesus Christ, being the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, relate to this world. We can use this to further deduce that life on other planets and all of that stuff is just a misnomer. It all is about what God created here, and that he's clothed in glory and beauty, and the connection there to him are his people that he created by promise through Jesus, or through Abraham. So again, it really narrows it down, and it's just like, well, what about all those other planets, all those things? Well, it's for his glory that he created those things. It's for his glory that he created them, so that Abraham would look at all of that and say, out of all of that, you're going to have descendants. That's why all of that is out there. Why is there so much sand? Why didn't he just make slabs of concrete? Kind of like the boat ramps when you go down into the lake, they're all smooth. You can just put on some flip flops or something and go in there. It's a lot easier than dealing with sand. But the intent of the sand and the intent of the stars is to emphasize that God is a person of promise, and that he would have more, descendants. Abraham would have more descendants, more people. And he's not just talking about the Jews. I think he's talking about the people who are descendants of Abraham by faith, children, sons of Abraham by faith. That there would be more than you can count, more than you can count. Okay, so lest we get bogged down, let's wrap up here. And Aaron's sons. So verse 40. Let's go to verse 41. And thou shalt put them upon Aaron, thy brother, and his sons with him, and thou shalt anoint them, and consecrate them, and sanctify them. So again, anointed for the Holy Spirit for the work, consecrated or washed, and then sanctified, set apart, that they may minister unto me in the priest's office. And thou shalt make them linen breeches, or now we call them breeches, or now we call them trousers, or maybe pants. So linen breeches to cover their nakedness from the loins even unto the thighs, they shall reach. And they shall be upon Aaron and upon his sons, and they shall come into the tabernacle of the congregation, or when they come near to the altar to minister in the holy place, that they bear not iniquity and die. It shall be a statute forever unto him and his seed after him. So again, we have all of these articles, the clothing, the garments, all of that. You're just going to, over the generations, have other people in them. But the articles of clothing will remain. It's part of the tabernacle. It's part of everything that relates to the worship of the people to God, and the atonement, and just the fellowship, that being a tent of meeting for people to come to. I was talking to Carla about this, because in this particular chapter and the coming couple chapters, then when we get into Leviticus, it can get we can get into just sort of the weeds. Wrong word. We can get into a lot of detail that can be like, wow, this can be exhausting. I'll do my best to draw things out, but the thing that Carla encouraged me with is that there are times, sadly, that Christians have never even gone through or read or know anything about this. So I guess we can just sort of rejoice. It may not be as nice or as fun as the Transfiguration, or going through the Matthew 24 and 25 with end times and the tribulation, or the New Jerusalem. It may not be on par with that at first, but I pray that you'll keep studying it and get some enthusiasm for these verses, because they do have a direct connection over to Jesus. And there's I believe that we'll go into eternity and still be looking at these verses, and our minds will get blown at the connections over what the Lord has designed and established that we missed, that we didn't even get, that he'll show us with respect to Jesus. So let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for your grace. Thank you that you are our high priest, that you